I don't think it's a stretch to say people love flying machines. They're inherently cool, inherently fast, and exhilarating. But here's the thing. While not as ignored as submarines, planes, and in particular jets, share a connection in their character of who they are. But few people, I feel, really realize that, and in fiction even further, the expression is so difficult without a good amount of time and effort put into understanding it. People love the idea of the machine, but that idea is so often restricted, and then when those limited visions are expressed, they just lack the reality of the aircraft. So I'll be blunt here. I don't think most people really get planes. And that is exactly what and who I am going to try to give to you today. But when we look up at aircraft, you should realize that, not unlike submarines, we in fact live on the bottom of an ocean of oxygen, the domain of those wonderful metal soaring things. Make clear, I know exactly why people don't inherently have that understanding. We as a species exist along the surface of our Earth. As high as we make our buildings and as tall a mountain as we can climb, we're always orienting to this inherent reference point we have evolved to find normal. Even at high speeds in automobiles or trains, we're always on the ground floor of a huge stretch of space and air up above us. Now before I go any further, I should mention, if I just continued on, I would come off as an annoying fuck who unreasonably seems to just be born with this sense of what the complex jet thing is, and aircraft in general, and kind of unreasonable to really have this dislike that most people don't get that. So I think it would help to go over where I'm coming from with this one. Okay, so the first and most important thing to do is to start young. Find a small child, and then lock them in a cage with a computer. On that computer, you give them only one game, and that game is Descent. Descent, just by its screenshots, looks to be a kind of Doom clone something, and this is all inside rooms. There's no sky. What's the deal? Well, it's simple. 6 degrees of freedom. Descent is beautiful as a starting point for getting a hang of things because the locations are clearly rooms and areas with a terrestrial reference point, but your movement, on the other hand, is unrestricted. Yaw, pitch, and roll smoothly let you reorient to engage in combat. Now, after a few years, the 2D reference point will be broken, and then we can move on. With a slightly better computer, the child can now be given Descent, the sequel, free space. Now the walls are gone, and the open vastness of space is a playground to be had. And now you might say, hey, there are other space games, what about Rogue Squadron? And to that I would say, hey, it's fun, but Rogue Squadron is, notice, rooted on a 2D plane of reference. And while indeed there are others, by breaking that reference point with Descent first, now, the full 3 dimensions of movement can be tapped into to be taken advantage of. And also, Free Space 2 is still basically the best space sim, fight me. But okay, that's all well and good, but here I think is the most critical point. Maybe the biggest important thing to take into account. I think most people's understandings of planes and jets are just more or less Star Wars, basically. They think of both spaceships and jets as always anchored in a 2D plane of reference and can just go wherever the fuck they want, and that's that. Up, down, every which way, more or less. So good. We've destroyed the 2D restriction. Now what? How do you get past the other restriction? How do we give our experimental child the other half of what is needed to kind of get these machines and their movement? The answer is obvious. Space is nice, but the sky is not space. The sky is in truth, much like the ocean, a dynamic and tumultuous place with layers of pressure, temperature, and difference. Storms, altitude, but all still under gravity's weight. We now have to attain that sense, get that intuitive idea of not just going in any direction, but really of moving through that dense thing in this atmosphere. So how do we do that, and what do we do that with? Well, the answer, of course, it's just... Hey, this is a robot show. These stupid robots are friggin' surfing. These aren't planes. And to that I would say, exactly! If one single thing helped me get a good grasp on the feeling of how a plane actually moves through the air, while ironically not being a plane, it was at Eka 7. The LFOs in the show are surfing, but for me, growing up, this was the thing that made it all click in my head. While they might be technically using all sorts of terminology and might technically be riding on the trapar waves and not the air itself, it doesn't really matter. What I could see and understand, just as somebody who was an audience member, was the physical aspect of the ref boards surfing across the air. They also encountered turbulence and had to deal with the adverse conditions of movement and weather. Even to go into a climb, they had to initiate a kind of rocket boost to gain altitude at times. And even if the mecha themselves are one big abstraction, the sense of their movement is what finally got me personally past that second hurdle of getting how planes work. Everything later, all the actual flight sims, actual playing games I played and so on, all built themselves off these first two big principles. One, understanding a 3D reference point for movement, how the machines can move, and understanding two, the dynamic conditions and just outright stuff air vehicles push off of and bank against and interact with to do what they do. I did not grow up around planes, I did not really play any actual flight sims early on, and none of my family members were active pilots or anything like it. This is how I built up my grasp of this concept. And so now I can gush. Airplanes are so fucking cool. But specifically, airplanes in my mind are this crossroad of systems. Like if you did not have anything more complex in terms of grasp, the airplane goes fast and then up, and then it slows and it comes down. But in truth, there's so much more going on here. Picture in your mind the machine. Imagine first, before anything else, its weight. It's so heavy, it surpasses animals, plants, and whole other machines who spend their entire time on the ground. The gravity of our world pinning it. Now picture its shape. The sharp teardrop edges, the narrow long body with its tall features, and glass-studded cockpit head. But now imagine the flow of the air over that carefully shaped machine. Don't think of numbers or math or anything too complex. Just on a windy day, what I like to do is just hold my arm up and just feel the wind roll over it, creating its little spinning vortexes and pressure zones. Now imagine that force being driven into by the machine. That same force running over and under the wings, building up ever so slightly, bit by bit, until at last, the suction on those wings heaves up. One of my favorite moments when I'm in an airplane, when all that mass, all that weight, is now tipped over by that force, and the lift surpasses it, and you can stretch out your legs, and no matter how hard you push down, you can feel the floor of the machine pushing up, back at you in spite of gravity, lifting you upward. A strength so big it could break your human bones, but the form of that machine withstands it. The wings and body picking up the whole machine, that force of lift gripping like a massive hand across the ribs of the machine and picking it up into the sky. And of course the engines, oh, how beautiful, spinning away, turning air and fuel into heat and energy and venting that energy out to make thrust, turning it into that pushing force that makes lift possible. The loud, thunderous roar of those engines and that conversion of potential to actual. And do not forget, the flow is so much more dynamic. The air up and over the wings, down the leading edge, around the nose cone, and between the horizontal and vertical stabilizers, the subtle changes and the creation of vortexes. And then set that whole picture loose into the skies, down through thick air and up through thin, through high and low moisture, clouds and clear sky, hot sections and cold. This is what I mean when I say I don't think most people really get airplanes. I think they think of like an X-Wing or some like Top Gun movie Tomcat just going up and down and doing loops or driving and climbing irrespective of direction or altitude. Yet at the same time, stiffly goddamn limited to a 2D reference of up and down. When in truth, the airplane, like I said, is this crossroads of forces and systems. It's like an organism, alive and flying within the physics of our world, diving up into that blue ocean over our heads. It's a beautiful thing I can just intuitively feel in my mind. That is why I get airplanes, I think. And I really think, without question, one of the masters of that feel is Hayao Miyazaki. Haha, sorry. You thought I was going to hit you with some Joe Hisaishi music there and leave you crying in a puddle of nostalgic tears, right? Sorry, listen, I'm trying to make a point here, and I need you to kind of be dialed in and not floating in a kind of masturbatory haze of Miyazaki visuals and dopamine buzz from remembering things, okay? Because here's the thing. Hayao Miyazaki also gets aircraft, but as a contrast, I'm going to mention a video that I think more or less spends 10 minutes missing that same point. Miyazaki's Airships by Royal Ocean Film Society. I don't like this video because, yeah, it's pretty pretentious, and also it kind of misses some key points. Firstly, he fucking insists on calling a bunch of shit ships.
Airships. Builds his ships from the ships.
And I know this is for flowery reasons, but listen, I love Zeppelins and blimps, so trust me, this is an airship, not this. This is an airplane or aircraft. This is an airship, not this. This, not this, okay? If you're gonna jerk off this stuff, at least do it fucking right. But specifically, moving on to the main thing, is that he tries to extrapolate this through line of Miyazaki capturing something important, and he says that it's done by focusing on the people and focusing on a more expressive camera perspective with machines as the center of the shot. But beyond unfairly featuring much lower budget TV anime next to Studio Ghibli's film budget animation with its famous attention to detail, and beyond the fact that mecha, plenty of mecha, focuses on the pilots and has visual centered shots on machines, he misses arguably the most important thing. Miyazaki gets airplanes. He grew up around them and loves them, and just understands them. The irony here is Royal Wes Anderson Boot Heel Society is mentioning details like he inherently is just not getting why they are real or what makes them work. I can even use some of his own examples here. For example, he mentions the Flopters from Castle in the Sky. They're this kind of high mobility thing, and it has this like rocket mode in a kind of normal VTOL flapping mode. And notice specifically that when they go into their rocket propulsion mode, the wings go flat. And this is because, with Miyazaki's nuanced aerodynamic understanding, he knows that the force of lift generated by the wings is no longer needed. The acceleration from the jets on the Flopter's wings would basically cause that lift, and if they were flapping, there would be huge drag. What's more, when these kind of wings buzz around in an almost insect-like fashion, part of that flap would have their flat side very exposed, and this would create massive drag and would likely just shear the wings off from the rocket force. As the Flopter's quad wing is very dragonfly-like, you can also see Miyazaki's love of nature and the parallel in biological aerodynamics as well. It's a dragonfly, flapping through the air, but also capable of gliding flatly on its wings. This is probably something Miyazaki directly pulled from. Likewise, even absolutely fantastical aircraft show off this understanding. Massive blimps and airplanes all feature moving parts and shifting flaps and so on, because even if it ain't props or jet engines, something has to be generating lift, and Miyazaki knows this. As another example, there's a very brutal shot here from Nausicaa, and it's a personal favorite. The Pejite gunship is doing what is in essence a textbook boom and zoom, following into a bounce. Emerging from the sun, see Bolka's list of 10 crazy fun party tricks for epic pilots. The pilot is using the sun to limit the visibility of the defensive gunners. As the gunship dives, using its altitude advantage, it fires off the front of the Tormekian Bumblecrow transport, hitting and destroying the cockpit before diving past. It will then leverage the trade of altitude for speed to move away. This is done so that now the defensive gunners, who are very aware of the gunship, have basically the lowest chance to really intercept it. This bounce and boom and zoom dive is basically trading the maximum speed to peel off and avoid getting hit by the return fire. This should also, of course, show you the other half of Miyazaki's relationship to planes and machines. Namely, he's a fucking hypocrite, and so am I. This is just kind of part of getting these machines, and really their character as well. They're wonderful things, carving through the skies, but they're also inherently destructive entities, and that's been one of their most aggressive driving evolutionary factors. And yes, you can try and emphasize Miyazaki's anti-war message or say he is conflicted all you want, but trust me, it's just a double-edged acceptance. There is no end solution. Just as much as you can love people and also fucking hate people, you can adore these wonderful things and also be disgusted by the same tremendous power that also shoots lightning up your spine with excitement. They're just two sides of the same coin. But also, Miyazaki ain't alone. He might be very goddamn good at it, but many amazing creators really have this. So let's move on to my dude Ichiro Itano. Yes, that Itano, the Missile Circus guy. That one. And a little thing called Edwards Air Force Base. Now, Kawamori, as the mechanical designer, gets a lot of credit for stuff. But as iconic as his mechanical designs are, Itano is the guy who really I admire, and another strong contender for someone who gets these machines. Arguably maybe more than Kawamori, going by the more recent Macross series. And the reason is simple. Itano is an action animation director. His specialty is in animating dynamic action in detail. So let's rewind a bit. Macross 2 came out and was retconned, don't think about it. But instead, Kawamori and Itano, amongst others, basically who worked on the original Macross anime, came back and with the advancements and glitz of late 80s, early 90s cell animation techniques, wanted to make a new series. As part of this, Kawamori and Itano went to, yes, that's right, Edwards Air Force Base. There, they were taken through some actual jet maneuvers. After which they did some dogfighting and Itano managed to score a kill on Kawamori. More importantly, Itano blacked out from G-Lock after the main pilot, who was also piloting the plane, landed. He recovered consciousness and then immediately got off the cockpit and wrote down what the experience was like in his notes. And that is why I think Macross Plus, despite, yes, also being another transforming robot show, also has a fantastic feel of its jets and planes. It's Itano. Just as the raw strain they put on their pilots and the whiplash maneuvers of these vehicles are so extreme, Itano really carried that through. What though is even more interesting is specifically that years later, Itano would also work on another piece of media, that being Cowboy Bebop's Knocking on Heaven's Door, a movie whose basically pre-climactic dogfight is fantastic as well, showing off a wonderful sense of weight. And yes, even if these are technically space fighter-like plane hybrids, Itano gave them a very jet-like sense of fighter quality, their movement and their mass. He even used a more dramatic and kind of Miyazaki-esque style of tracking the vehicle centrally while the world is what moves around the frame. The animation here shows the planes straining against turns, showing off the mass of their dives and rolls, really pushing themselves to evade missiles and escape oncoming fire. Itano's vision of aircraft is this really, a high-energy one, definitely born of the jet fighter age and his personal experience with them. Now another group who had also puts really loads of mechanical detail into everything they did, but also in particular with planes, was early Gainax. It's a bit ironic, but the best example is actually an early one, when Gainax made an attempt at potentially doing a kind of Studio Ghibli-like setup with film production. Wings of Honeymaze, a movie ostensibly about a space program developing in the middle of a pitched Cold War about to go hot, was the focus. But it's abundantly clear from the aerial scenes that this was Gainax really strutting their stuff in terms of their animation skill. And this is something that Sickle Cell Capri Sun VHS Geriatry also fails to bring up. A lot of this shit just needs money. And by that I mean you ain't getting a good attention to mechanical detail like this, or in Macross Plus, or whatever, without, yes, talented artists, and people who inherently get machines, like aircraft, but also absolutely a good bit of backing cash. So it's unfair to hold up a TV anime budget to this standard without both those backing elements. Not every artist has the cash or the Miyazaki I'm going to sleep in the studio and redo 2,000 frames of animation ability, okay? That being said, it's abundantly clear Gainax was pulling from and either watching or reconstructing fighter mechanics here. For all 5 minutes of their presence, the raw visual detail and accuracy is fantastic. The drop tanks that almost remind me of the English Electric Lightnings peeling off the fighters before they engage. These do so to lighten the load and make them more maneuverable for combat. The spray of bullets with their bright tracers. And notice how the planes don't instantly explode when they are hit, but instead, like in real life, these myriad aerodynamic forces I mentioned before that have once been constrained are now liberated by the bullet holes in the structures of the machine, and thus these forces will now tear apart the aircraft with their astounding power. The rolling head-over-tail crash of jet before it explodes as the compression of the fuel and impact ignites, the rocket pod fire from another one of the jets. If I had to guess, I would say Gainax was for sure pulling from Vietnam footage at the very least. But finally, I think I have to end on the Skycrawlers. See, there is something I can't really forgive most people for. People love to fixate on action, speed, and destruction, and all of that is really out in spades with planes. And yes, they are indeed very cool. But at the same time, I feel much like the 2D perspective, much like the Star Wars simplified idea of flight, people only get as far as the flashy fight scenes and unfortunately no further. But one of the most important things is to realize how much of these flying machines just is so much more than that. The lingering tension and anxiety of the danger of what do you have to do when you fly is contrasted on so many moments of just waiting to land and take off, and of keeping steady and aware of the condition of the skies around you. For me, Skycrawlers has a beautiful sense of its planes, flight, and its movement, but it's the in-between moments all around these that, unfortunately, while not as popular, do capture and embody that, I feel. Anyone who has ever flown out of an airbase knows that excited tension in the back of your spine, the tingle of being near a runway, near a ramp, because you know, it's not just this series of hangars and flat straight bits of land. It's a portal to the skies themselves, where we could live or die, depending on our skill. When people only focus on all the flashy bits of flying, all the backflips and colbits and all the bullshit, and ignore all these other moments that are inherent to the airplane, it's almost like a parody to me. Like a crowd of blind people clapping and cheering for this cool master painting they can't really see or perceive. I deeply love these beautiful, horrible machines. These things that let us soar as we always dreamed about doing, and who rain down destruction on the world they are lifted over. I do hope I managed to communicate maybe a bit of that core feeling I have for them. In the next part, we will be looking at the 2002 to 2005 OVA, also by Studio Gonzo, Sento Yosei Yukikaze.